Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar session. It's hosted by Molloy University's Siena Center for Social Justice as part of our Women's History Month events. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel of Molloy University's Center for Social and Ethical Concerns. I would like to especially thank the support staff of the Philosophy Department, the School of Arts and Sciences, and the Siena Center for helping make this event possible. My name is Jennifer Scuro. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Molloy, but more importantly, advisor to our philosophy club. I am a dark-haired white woman wearing clear pink glasses, and I have my philosophy books on a bookshelf behind me and my lovely flower orchid. I'm wearing black and white with a blue sweater. I'm so happy to host this webinar with our speaker, having taught and wrote about Dr. Manne's work over the past few years, and it connects to my work. Not only we're both trained philosophers, but because her work, like mine, expands academic philosophy to other fields, feminist theory, cultural studies, disability studies, and also we make our work broad to a non-academic public. I'm looking forward to hearing about the complexities of how a broad public responds to the work of philosophers, especially women philosophers who write about risky and complicated ideas. This event emerged out of a conversation with our philosophy club members and our psychology club members. Their fantastic advisor is Jamie Vetrano, assistant professor of psychology. And as a coordinated effort to bring Dr. Manne to speak to our community, I'd like to thank our philosophy club leaders, Stephanie, Gina, Ryan, and Kritika, and Sarah and Arsh, the club leaders for psychology. Welcome, Dr. Manne. Some of our questions and our time together will be from the students and the faculty, with priority from our philosophy club and psychology club students. For those of you who are part of the Molloy community, Dr. Manne's books, Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny from 2018, and Unshrinking, How to Face Fatphobia from 2024 are now available as ebooks through the JET Library. And these books are on hard copy display in the library for the Women's History Month. So thanks to library staff for acquiring the copies and making them available very, very quickly and willingly. And I strongly recommend everyone visit the library in Kelleberg Hall and check those out. So I want to do some housekeeping. Content warning, there's significant discussion about topics that are distressing and really difficult considering the subject matter in hand, particularly misogyny and fatphobia. Dr. Manne herself has written on the importance of these warnings, sometimes also called trigger warnings, in both the New York Times and WNYC's On the Media. I might put that in the Q&A if you're interested in those links. Mental health and wellness. It's important that us hosting an event like this, and by learning and discussing this kind of challenging content at length, that you take care of yourself. For some of you, I find that this is true for myself, that learning about misogyny and fatphobia is also a form of self-care. It requires a lot of tenderness and gentleness. So get comfortable, pace yourself, and as you need, and if you need, Molloy University has a mental health and wellness center that provides telehealth services to the community at large. You can email mhwc@molloy.edu or call 516-323-3854. For Molloy University students seeking more support, please visit the Student Personal Counseling Center or call 516-323-3484. As far as accessibility and closed captioning, this session is being recorded, or of course, until Dr. Manne decides. This won't go up on YouTube, but it will be posted later. And after the official YouTube posting recording, the entire session will be recorded, but we'll have about maybe 15-20 minutes of open Q&A to discuss with the group. That part will not go on YouTube. Please activate the captioning if you need, and feel free to use the Q&A for any other issues of accessibility. If you have them, we'll be monitoring. Let me see if I got that. Oh yeah, and you're more than welcome to visit the YouTube channel of Molloy University's Center for Social and Ethical Concerns. We already have just posted the programming from Disability Awareness Month last December, and one video is featuring a faculty panel discussing the intersection of disability and health. And then the other was a session with author and artist Riva Lair. A quick thank you to Andrea Morgan-Eason and Kathy Macente, co-chairs of the Siena Center for Social Justice Advisory Committee, as well as to Jean Kimple, the chair of the Women's History Month Planning Committee, for their support in putting together this webinar. Dr. Manne requested that this event be open to the public. So on behalf of your audience, we thank you. So on to the event. Our speaker, Kate Manne, has been Associate Professor of the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell since 2013. Prior to her appointment at Cornell, Dr. Manne was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows, did her graduate work in philosophy at MIT, and as an undergraduate student at the University of Melbourne, her hometown, she studied philosophy, logic, and computer science. Dr. Manne's work covers moral philosophy, including metaethics, moral psychology, feminist philosophy, and social philosophy. She also writes opinion pieces, essays, and reviews for a wider audience. The topics of her first and third most recent book are the focus of our discussion today. Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, describes the nature, function, and persistence of misogyny. Her most recent book, Unshrinking, How to Face Fatphobia, came out in January 2024. I want to add that I've been listening to the audiobook version of Unshrinking that Dr. Manne narrates, and I feel like we've been keeping company. So I very much appreciate your thoughtful care in laying out and laying bare the personal, philosophical, and political dimensions of fatphobia. It's very meaningful to me. So Dr. Manne, please feel free to start. You can share your screen now. I do want to mention that I'm also interested, so when that time comes, to mention the work on moral gaslighting. In part, I omitted this part, but Dr. Manne's second book is entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women. That came out in the summer of 2020. That might also be something worth looking up and referencing. Thank you so much. And Dr. Manne.
Thank you so much, Professor Scuro. I'm so honored to be here. It's so wonderful to get this opportunity to speak about these topics dear to my heart that I care about so passionately. And I also wanted to thank everyone at Molloy University who has put in so much time and labor and care into planning and hosting this event. So many thanks to Dr. Scuro and her colleagues. So I wanted to start today by talking about some work that comes out of my first book, Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, which I hope helps us to locate the concept of misogyny that I'm working with in conceptual space and relative to maybe more traditional or familiar ways of thinking about misogyny, which I argue are actually less helpful in helping us navigate the social world. So according to my proposed definition of misogyny, which I again moot in this first book, misogyny is primarily a property of social systems or environments, in as much as girls and women face hostility and hatred within those environments that has a particular function. It functions to police and enforce patriarchal norms and expectations. So there's a lot of moving parts to that definition, and I'm going to be breaking that down slowly and carefully. But just to highlight at the beginning what that does to the concept of misogyny, it makes misogyny a structural phenomenon rather than an individual one. It makes misogyny a political phenomenon rather than a psychological one. And perhaps most centrally, it's about what girls and women face, not what men feel. So you'll notice that according to this definition, misogyny is not about what men feel deep in their hearts towards girls and women. There's no supposition on this view, even that it will be predominantly men who are perpetuating misogyny. That might be the case. I think it probably is the case, along with social structures and institutions. But misogyny can be something that women face at the hands of other girls and women, as well as institutions, practices, artworks, along with individuals and individual actions. Okay, so let's continue to break down this definition of misogyny. And I think an initial helpful starting point to doing so is contrasting my definition with what I call, somewhat pejoratively, perhaps tendentiously, the naive definition of misogyny. So this is a dictionary-style definition of misogyny, which says that misogyny is primarily a property of individual agents who hate any and every woman and girl, or at least they hate women and girls very generally. So I'm arguing against this definition of misogyny, in part because it makes misogyny very difficult to instantiate. Now, the reason why that is if you look at my proposed definition of misogyny and look at those patriarchal norms and expectations that I hold misogyny enforces and polices, imagine a world in which a woman or girl is conforming very closely to those dictates of misogyny, of patriarchy. So she is, according to these norms and expectations, often expected to be pleasing, to serve other people, especially men in her environment, especially dominantly situated men. And an analogy that I like to use for this way of thinking about things is you can imagine a girl or woman who is a server at a restaurant who is waiting on a male patron. So he's waiting for his meal to be served, and she's doing everything right. She's smiling, she's deferring, she's subservient, she's serving delicious apple pie in a timely manner. And the question to ask yourself is, well, what's to hate exactly? Why would this patron be really hostile and hateful towards this woman if she's doing all of these things to please and serve him and to kind of center his experience and have the customer is always right as her mantra? And she is making his experience as comfortable and pleasurable as possible. So this analogy for thinking about misogyny suggests that it would be very psychologically odd if girls and women in this kind of general social position of pleasing and serving and conforming to patriarchal norms and expectations that say that women should do this kind of thing in the social world, it would be very surprising if they were subject to hatred and hostility in a very general way. That would make misogyny a very unusual psychological property and also very hard to know about because many people will defend themselves against accusations of misogyny in the naive sense by saying, oh, I don't hate women deep down. Really deep down, I'm just insecure. Or really deep down, I just feel bad about myself. And it will be hard to actually know or form justified beliefs about misogyny on the naive definition. So it will effectively make accusations of misogyny very difficult to substantiate. And as we'll see in a moment, one advantage, I think, to my conception of misogyny, my structural and as well as intersectional approach to misogyny, is that it makes the epistemology of misogyny more tractable. In other words, it makes misogyny something we can have reasonable beliefs about, justified beliefs about, even knowledge about, without doing kind of deep psychological analysis best left between a person and their therapist and not done from the philosophical armchair. Okay, so on my definition of misogyny, there is no supposition that misogyny will target any and every girl and woman. It may target girls and women quite selectively, given interactions between their other social positions and the patriarchal norms and expectations which they might be violating. So two parts of that definition. This acknowledges that girls and women may have very different social roles and be subject to very different norms and expectations, depending on other facets of their intersecting social identities. So on Kim Crenshaw's important framework, what Professor Crenshaw emphasizes is that girls and women are not just girls and women in a kind of racial vacuum, they're also girls and women who may be subject to racism, particularly in the US context, anti-indigeneity and anti-Black racism. And that may affect, and in fact does, minutely affect the kind of norms and expectations to which they're also subject. There are also, of course, norms and expectations that differ with class, that differ with sexuality, that differ with being trans versus cis, that differ with being disabled, and that differ, as we'll see in this talk, with the kinds of norms of beauty to which a girl or woman may or may not adhere. Okay, so I hope that makes some sense that misogyny can home in on girls and women who are kind of behaving badly according to patriarchal norms and expectations. So to go back to this analogy of the waitress, it might be that someone who is a man who is disappointed that his apple pie is not served hot enough, or that she's taking too long to serve him, that will be the waitress who is subject to hostile, hateful reactions because she's not performing her service roles in what is perceived as a sufficiently good manner. So that will tend to be the person who will most reliably attract misogynistic ire and anger and resentment and rage. Okay, so I wanted also at the outset to contrast my proposed definition of misogyny with how I think about sexism. Because oftentimes misogyny and sexism are terms that are used more or less interchangeably. So, or misogyny is just used as a kind of more extreme version of sexism. And that's not how I think about it. So I hold that sexism, unlike misogyny, is primarily a matter of beliefs and cultural narratives and other facets of ideology that function to rationalize and naturalize patriarchal norms and expectations. For example, by depicting women as quote unquote naturally less suited to masculine coded roles like leadership positions in business, in academia, in sports, in politics, and also that depict women as, again, naturally well suited to playing caregiving roles, this kind of pleasing and serving role that sexism holds sexism holds women unnaturally well suited to performing. So I think of misogyny as kind of kicking in when sexism doesn't fully control women enough to make women conform to the patriarchal norms and expectations that misogyny then polices and punishes women for not conforming to. So for a metaphor, misogyny is misogyny is like going on witch hunts, and sexism is wearing a lab coat. So sexism is something that has all these beliefs, it turns out false beliefs about the differences between men and women, boys and girls, and naturalizes gender roles in a way that says this is just what people will naturally be drawn to in society. Whereas misogyny goes on witch hunts and is this kind of active, dynamic, potentially violent way of enforcing these roles when sexism doesn't suffice to allot people to these or to siphon people into these allotted roles. So a way to think about it for those of you who are familiar with these concepts in philosophy is that sexism is a matter of world-guided attitudes, so things like beliefs. It's like a theory about how the world is gender-wise, whereas misogyny is world-guiding. It says how the world has to be, and it will enforce these gender roles when people, especially women and girls, are not conforming to them. And I have a little picture here on the slides from the first female Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard's now famous misogyny speech from 2012, really worth a look if you want to YouTube it later. But she basically gave a speech protesting sexism and misogyny in Australia. And it was really telling that the examples of misogyny she chose were kind of vicious, often personal attacks to which she'd been subject as the first female prime minister, things like the opposition leader standing behind a sign and giving the thumbs up to a sign that said "ditch the witch" in reference to her leadership, and also her being called a liar. Her nickname in Australia was Juliar for Julia. And also her being called incredibly untrustworthy when she was not perfect, but probably more trustworthy than the average politician. And she also gave examples of sexism that I think illustrate and conform to this definition that I've given here, where it was kind of stereotypical beliefs like that the women of Australia would be the ones in the household doing the ironing, which was also evinced by a speech of then opposition leader who later became Prime Minister himself, Tony Abbott. Okay, so I think that this way of tracking the definition of sexism versus misogyny is partly my attempt to do something useful with language and make a clear contrast between these terms, but it does reflect strands in ordinary usage too that we saw in this speech. So here I wanted to talk about the epistemology of misogyny, which some of you may be very familiar with this term from your philosophy classes at Molloy. Some of you may not have heard this term before, and it's basically just a fancy philosopher's term for things we know, how we form reasonable beliefs and justified knowledge, how we acquire information, where knowledge is kind of the gold standard, and a little bit down from there are things that might fail to be knowledge, but are at least justified beliefs that we have about the social as well as empirical world, or about anything for that matter. So on my view, where according to my definition of misogyny, we can know or reasonably believe that girls and women face misogyny if they're subject to one of two things. First, they can be subject to disproportionately hostile and hateful attitudes, as well as actions, practices, institutions, artworks, etc., which serve this function of policing and enforcing patriarchal norms and expectations. And by the way, if you're wondering in more detail what these patriarchal norms and expectations are, that is going to be the subject of much of the rest of the talk. So disproportionate hostility is one way we figure out misogyny is taking place. Another way we figure out misogyny is taking place is distinctively hostile and hateful attitudes. So for an example, it turns out that when women write for a public audience, so for a popular media outlet, they face disproportionate amounts of hostility, regardless of the subject matter. And that emerged from a study of writers in The Guardian, where it turned out that 8 of the 10 writers who attracted the most abuse in the online comment section when they were still doing that, they've stopped partly because of this study, those were women. And 10 out of 10 of those who attracted the least in the way of abuse were men. And it turned out women of color were disproportionately affected again by hostility. So that's to point again to the intersectionality of misogyny. Yeah, this evidences the way that the disproportionate criterion can be instantiated. So another way that misogynistic hostility can be demonstrated and that we can learn that it's happening is that women are facing distinctively gendered attacks. So things that a man generally wouldn't be called, or at least if he were called this, it would be in a different vein with kind of a different resonance. So calling a woman a quote unquote bitch, among other gendered epithets, you can insert ones that you can imagine here that might be even worse. Again, being threatened with things like rape, that are not exclusively directed at women, but are predominantly threatened towards women, again, as studies show, and are also experienced disproportionately by women. Those distinctively, although again, not exclusively, gendered kinds of hostility will be evidence misogyny is taking place. Maybe not decisive evidence, but at least good defeasible evidence that this is an instance of misogyny. And I have just a link to this study here of that study of Guardian writers and how their gender affected the way they were perceived. And by the way, when I talk about men versus women here, this is not in any reflection of my own view that I do not believe that these are exclusive or exhaustive gender categories, but sometimes, unfortunately, non-binary folks haven't been fully studied or are so underrepresented in writing for The Guardian that they couldn't actually study it, I think, in this instance. But often non-binary folks are even worse affected by misogynistic mechanisms, and also ones that are distinctive to people who are neither men nor women, or who identify as both male and female. So just to make that clear that I am in no way buying into the itself patriarchal and sexist misogynistic idea that people just come into genders. They don't. But we don't always have the studies of non-binary folks too. Okay, so going from misogyny to misogynists. So a really natural question that many of you will have is, what is a misogynist then? Because certainly the naive definition of misogyny makes it clear that a misogynist would be someone who really hates girls and women, maybe all girls and women, maybe most. So you might wonder, well, if you're running with this proposed and kind of more complicated definition of misogyny, this structural intersectional approach, then how do we define a misogynist? And what I do say is that an individual agent counts as a misogynist in as much as they're particularly and or consistently liable to channel and or perpetuate misogyny relative to others in their social environment. So I basically treat misogynist as a threshold term where once someone reaches a certain level of perpetuating and channeling misogyny relative to other individuals in their environment, they count as a misogynist. And tongue in cheek, I call these people overachievers in a misogynistic social system. And similarly, you can see misogynist here as a kind of warning label for the prime offenders, because I think we all channel misogyny to some degree, me included. I don't think any of us is exempt from channeling these social forces, but some people deserve the label misogynist because they reach a certain level of they're posing a danger to girls and women. Okay, so I wanted now to get into a concrete paradigm case of misogyny, which comes from the writer Lindy West, because this will also start to bridge into material about fat phobia that I wanted to point to the intersection of misogyny and fat phobia in the last kind of third of this talk. So this case study of misogyny comes from her article from 2015, What Happened When I Confronted My Cruelest Troll, a Guardian piece that you can look up. And what basically happened was that Lindy West was a prominent feminist, fat activist writer online, and she had a lot of online abuse, as do many of us. But her cruelest troll was someone who actually impersonated her recently deceased beloved father, Paul West, and his Twitter account name was Poor West Dunzo, where his bio read, embarrassed father of an idiot, other two kids are fine though. So referencing the fact that he was embarrassed about Lindy. And he would write her really nasty screeds and write about how stupid she was and how no one should listen to her. And yeah, doing this is bad enough, but doing it as if in the voice of her beloved deceased father, who she was still grieving, that was particularly cruel. And West eventually wrote a piece, again, in a prominent national outlet. I think it was might have been The Stranger, where she wrote about how this affected her and how awful it was to wake up to mean tweets that impersonated her dead father. And the troll, to West's surprise, wrote her back and apologized and said, I don't know why I did this. This is really unacceptable behavior on my part. I will not do it again, and I'm truly sorry. And West found herself wondering in the intervening years, well, why did he apologize? And why did he target me in the first place? And eventually what she did is she interviewed this man for the incredible and very popular podcast and radio show, This American Life. So we get insight into this man's thinking and why he targeted West from this interview that she did, this incredible interview after they had had this confrontation and reconciliation. And he was surprisingly lucid about why he had targeted her. So I'm going to read from this interview. He said, when you talked about being proud of who you are and where you're going, that kind of stoked that anger that I had. Lindy West said, okay, so you found my writing. You found my writing and you did not like it. Man says certain aspects of it. You used a lot of all caps. You're just a very You almost have no fear when you write. You know, it's like you stand on the desk and you say, I'm Lindy West, and this is what I believe in. F you if you don't agree with me. And even though you don't say those words exactly, I'm like, who is this bitch who thinks she knows everything? Lindy West says, well, I asked him that way. I asked him if he felt that way because I'm a woman. And the man says, oh, definitely, definitely. Women are being more forthright in their writing. There isn't a sense of timidity to when they speak or when they write. They're saying it loud. And I think that for me, it's threatening at first. Lindy West says, right. You must know that's why I do that, because people don't expect to hear from women like that. And I want other women to see me do that, and I want women's voices to get louder. The man says, I understand. I understand. Here is the thing. I work with women all day, and I don't have an issue with anyone. I could have told you back then if someone had said to me, oh, you're a misogynist, you hate women. And I could have said, nah, I loved my mom. I love my sisters. I loved the girlfriends that I've had in my life. But you can't claim to be okay with women and then go online and insult them, seek them out to harm them emotionally. Okay, so I think this is just right. I think that this troll has an unusual amount of insight into why he targeted West. And he also made it clear in some of the previous discussion that he was doing so because he himself felt bad about his own fat body, and that West, as an unapologetically and self-identified fat woman, was making him feel like, why does she get to feel okay about herself even though she's fat? So to her troll, Lindy West was plausibly perceived as and served as a representative example of a woman who violates, challenges, and resists gendered norms and expectations of a patriarchal nature, both in terms of what she was saying. She was a feminist writer who complained, for example, that rape jokes that punch down towards rape victims are not a good choice for professional comedians to be making. She was saying it as a successful and unapologetically fat woman who wasn't saying it was bad to be fat, who was saying, this is my body and I'm not apologizing for it. I'm proud to be who I am, as a feminist as well as a fat activist. And she was saying it in an outspoken, quote unquote, loud way. The title of her subsequent memoir is Shrill, which you might also know for the fabulous TV show it became on Hulu, starring the resplendent Edie Bryant. So this is to contrast with the historical expectation that women will defer to others' views, particularly male views, be self-effacing, cooperative, submissive, small, quiet, not too loud, meek, etc. And so misogyny's classic target, I hold, will be a non-conforming woman. And misogyny will often be triggered by gender deviant behavior, including behavior from trans women, including behavior from women who are perceived as too masculine, including behavior from women who are perceived as too outspoken, too feminist, too fat. And I don't hold that misogyny only targets women like that. It's important to be clear that, as it were, misogyny's grasp often exceeds its reach, to invert a line from Burns here. So it might be going after gender non-conforming women, but over-policing is a real thing, and it will often go after any and every woman if a woman is kind of being someone who is subject to the kinds of norms and practices that are particularly targeting gender deviant women, but can affect any and every girl or woman. So, for example, really draconian anti-abortion laws might go after a woman who is not maternal and doesn't want to care for a young child or infant, but it will affect any and every girl or woman who needs healthcare that can involve abortion, because of things like miscarriage, things like non-viable fetuses, and also health concerns and complications that can necessitate abortion care for any girl or woman. So the original targets might have been women who didn't want to have children or to add to their families, but the targets turn out to extend well beyond that. as we are seeing in tragic ways play out in America today. Now, I'm going to skip over some of this material in the interest of time about misogyny not necessarily dehumanizing women, but we can talk about that in the Q&A when we turn to those questions. A really good one is misogyny a dehumanizing attitude as well as practice? And my answer to that will be no. I think women are often targeted for human, all too human offenses and characteristics, like being outspoken, like being someone whose voice is too audible and who also expresses kind of human vulnerability. So going back to this slide on concepts of misogyny, we've kind of been over now how misogyny is a structural and a political phenomenon. And now I wanted to get into, well, what are the patriarchal norms and expectations that misogyny serves to police and enforce? And here I've included just a picture of my second book entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women, because a lot of this material is drawn from the second book that kind of answers this good question about what are these patriarchal norms and expectations that are being enforced by misogyny. And my answer to that is that it is primarily a matter of the false sense that privileged men are entitled to certain goods from similarly or less privileged girls and women, such as sex, such as love, care, labor, admiration, consent, control, support, power, deference. And that girls and women are often not deemed entitled to these goods, like, for example, healthcare, including, as I just mentioned, adequate reproductive health care that will always encompass abortion care, even when we are genuinely entitled to those goods. Okay, so what I want now to do in the last third of this talk is to give 3 examples of where a patriarchal norm and expectation is violated, and so misogyny kicks in. And I'll be particularly interested in one application, which has to do with beauty norms and expectations of thinness, and what happens when that expectation is violated by girls and women. Okay, so one and the first of the applications that I want to delve into here is incels. So for those of you who haven't heard this term before, these are, the term is short for involuntary celibate. And while it was initially coined in relation to a woman who didn't objectionably insist she was entitled to sex, she just felt lonely for sexual attention and dating and so on. But incels are young, typically young, invariably cis het men who embody a sense of entitlement to sex, yes, but still more insidiously, I hold, to things like a woman's care and love and affection and admiration. And so it's not just that these young men would be satisfied by, for example, availing themselves of a sex worker who could give them sexual satisfaction within the context of sex work. They would be, they're really looking for a woman to lavish affection and admiration of an authentic kind on them. So the probably best known, and if you like, patron saint, as he's sometimes called in these communities of incels, is Elliot Rodger, who was a 22-year-old man who had a series of rants that he posted on YouTube, as well as a so-called manifesto, really more of a memoir, where he talked about feeling deprived of all of these things. So in one quote from his last video, which I've posted a shot of, and fair warning, this is extremely tough material, so this is where a big trigger warning for misogynistic violence is necessary. But Elliot Rodger said in this YouTube video, "You girls," and here he was mentioning girls, but he really meant a particular kind of girl, hot, blonde, thin, the kind of girl who would confer on him a high degree of sexual and social status. So you girls have never been attracted to me, he said. It's always hard to put these words in my own mouth, but I'm just going to read them. I don't know why you aren't attracted to me, but I will punish you all for it. It's an injustice, a crime. I don't know what you don't see in me. I'm the perfect guy. So he went on to say, in a similar vein, girls, again in reference to a particular kind of girl, all I ever wanted was to love you and be loved by you. I've wanted a girl, I've wanted sex, I've wanted a girlfriend, I've wanted sex, I've wanted love, affection, adoration. You think I'm unworthy of it? That's a crime that can never be forgiven. So again, he is saying that he feels entitled to affection, love, sex, all of the package deal of sexual attention and admiration from girls and women, and that the fact that no one who meets his criteria of someone who's worth dating has lavish attention on him, that is, not just a bummer or a disappointment to him, it's something that is, he says, a crime, an unforgivable crime, because he feels that it's not just something he would like to have happen, it's something he feels entitled to have happen, and that girls and women owe him this. For those of you who don't know, he went on to commit a shooting spree where he shot and murdered 3 people, having already stabbed and murdered his 3 flatmates. So he murdered 6 people that day before killing himself, and he also shot and wounded 14 other people in this misogynistic rampage, the expression of his potent sense of entitlement to sexual attention and admiration. So in this case, the norm and expectation that was being violated is that men or men of a certain social status have this norm of being attended to in this way by girls and women, and expect that some woman, no woman in particular, but some woman will lavish this kind of affection and attention on them. So pretty dark stuff. Okay, so moving on to the second application of this framework for thinking about misogyny and entitlement, I also wanted to mention, in the vein of what girls and women are deprived of, the healthcare disparities faced by girls and women, especially, again, remembering that this is an explicitly intersectional approach, Black and Indigenous girls and women in the US context. So girls and women, especially girls and women of color, suffering from pain and health problems, are routinely dismissed as hysterical, oversensitive, even as malingerers, where people will go to seek medical attention, even to the ER, and be turned away or regarded as, potentially faking it, as just seeking pain medication, opiates, and so on, when they have severe health problems that need urgent medical attention. And this is a particularly terrible and potentially tragic thing for Black and Indigenous women who are people who are pregnant in the US context, who face 3 to 4 times the maternal mortality of white pregnant people. So pretty terrible stuff. What I do within this discussion in my second book is trace these inequities to the pernicious sense that girls and women are deemed obligated to provide care and attention to others, and they're not entitled to ask for or receive it, especially in as much as they occupy other intersecting social positions that are marginalized in virtue of race and class and being trans and so on, and being disabled. Okay, so a third application of this framework, which gets me to my third book project that I was asked to talk about today, is fat phobia, understood as something that can affect anyone with a body. So it's certainly not something that is exclusive to girls and women, but I think it does particularly and distinctively and disproportionately affect girls and women, so meets the definition of an intersecting form of oppression that instantiates and can constitute misogyny, in as much as it polices and enforces a patriarchal, as well as, it turns out, white supremacist beauty norm of thinness. So this is just the picture of the cover of my third book that I was asked to talk about today, Unshrinking: How to Face Fat Phobia, where I argue that strands of fat phobia include moral dimensions, so holding that fat people have less worthy moral characters, that they are lax, lazy, weak-willed, and that they're kind of letting people down by having fat bodies, and that they're in minute control of their body size, which turns out to be empirically false. There are intellectual dimensions to fat phobia, so impugning fat people's mental acuity and competence and brilliance in ways that are unfair and inaccurate. Aesthetic dimensions, that is what I'm going to concentrate on here, impugning fat people's desirability, and in particular their sexual status. And this is interesting because one thing that I get into in the book in terms of data is it's not that fat people are necessarily regarded as not sexually attractive, in as much as it turns out that fat bodies, especially fat women's bodies, are a really common search term in pornography. So fat women appear to be being judged to be, if I may use this somewhat provocative turn of phrase in this context, deemed fuckable but not lovable. So fat women are often masturbated to in private, but not regarded as suitable material for dating and enhancing someone's sexual cum social status. So if you think back to someone like Elliot Rodger, he was looking for a hot blonde woman, implicitly at least a thin one, who he could date and have confer on him higher status in a way that generally women in fat bodies don't and can't do, given the current beauty norms of our society. So finally, and this is something that we can delve into more in Q&A, there are also health dimensions of fat phobia, where it turns out that the relationship between fatness and health is actually pretty complicated, with people in the quote unquote overweight category of the notoriously problematic BMI charts having the lowest all-cause mortality of anyone. This is a complicated relationship, but in popular discourse, it's often deemed as a simple relationship where basically the thinner you are, the better, and fat people are automatically unhealthy, doomed to die of fatness. And I hold that those simple beliefs are fat phobic, even though it is true that there are correlations between being very heavy and having more health risks, which may be a matter of mere correlation rather than causation, given that there is a lot going on for people in the high weight categories, including things like weight stigma and inadequate healthcare and what's called weight cycling that has deleterious health effects. Okay, we can again get into that more when you ask questions. But to give you now evidence of the distinctive and disproportionate impact of fat phobia on girls and women, we find that wage gaps for girls and women are much higher for fat versus thin women as compared with fat men. So for a very fat versus a very thin woman who was born in the 1980s, like me for the record, so millennials, there is a $40,000 annual average wage gap between those very fat and very thin women, which is just an enormous annual average wage gap based on holding qualifications and education fixed, but thinking about, seeing how her body size is determinative of wages. Whereas for fat men, generally wage gaps don't kick in until a man becomes very fat. And sometimes even then, we don't find those effects in all studies. It differs depending on the particular analysis. Whereas wage gaps for fat versus thin women are found very consistently, and they kick in at pretty low weights. If a woman gains as little as 15 pounds, she's often subject to significant wage penalties that show up in this data. So we find a much higher rate of eating disorders for girls and women. Again, this does affect boys and men, and that's important, but it affects girls and women much more commonly and widely. And we also find that parents contribute to this by policing girls' bodies more so than their sons. So you find things like parents are more likely to Google whether their girl is overweight versus whether their son is. They're also more likely, I think a bit tragically, to Google whether their daughter is ugly, although how Google is meant to determine the answer to that question is anyone's guess. And finally, there is evidence of distinctively, perhaps exclusively gendered practices like hogging or a pig roast, where fraternity brothers will actually compete at universities, including Cornell, 10 years ago at least, to see who can bed the heaviest or fattest woman on campus. So these violent, noxious, fatphobic practices show that fat phobia and misogyny are deeply in cahoots, and that I would go so far as to say fat phobia can be a form of misogyny. So it's important to note that just as this analysis of misogyny is deeply intersectional, our analysis of fat phobia has to be as well. So the norm of thinness is not just patriarchal, it's also born of white supremacy. And here I have the cover of a fabulous book by Sabrina Strings, the sociologist that you all are encouraged to look up and read. This book argues that there are racial and gendered origins of this norm for Anglo-American women, where basically fat phobia, unlike misogyny, was not really systemic until the mid-18th century. So there were elements of fat phobia in ordinary discourse, but oftentimes the fat body was regarded as a sign of wealth and luxury and abundance until the mid-18th century, when white racist pseudoscientists began to look for ways to differentiate the white body from the black body, who was being enslaved so brutally and in ever-burgeoning numbers during this historical moment in Anglo-America. So the kind of myth and rumor began that black bodies were heavier, and that wasn't based on fact, it was based on speculation by, again, garbage scientists who had never been oftentimes to the relevant parts of Africa, but they theorized that the black body was fat. And it was then after that association between fatness and blackness was drawn that fatness fell into disrepute. So it's important to be clear about the historical order here. It's not that fatness was derogated and then fatness and blackness were associated. It went the other way. Fatness and blackness were associated, and then fatness became something that was seen as a sign of being depraved and primitive, and all of these other racist, noxious stereotypes about people's characters and acumen. And if you're wondering how this racist idea of behind fat phobia became so widespread in the world today, the answer is basically that it was exported through Western media to other cultures, where you see things like after the exporting of TV shows like Friends and women's magazines, you find a rise in the spate of eating disorders among girls and women shortly thereafter. Okay, so I only have a couple more slides and a minute or two more here to go. But what this framework will help us do, I hope, is that it will help us expose the high costs and punishment faced by fat, female, as well as femme bodies in particular. And again, this isn't to say that men don't face fat phobia. I think they do, but I think it's, again, particularly pointy for girls and women in realms like dating and partnership. And here I have a photo that was used to as a piece of artwork for a very personal piece that I wrote about my own history with some of these norms for the cut that I wrote in January. And we'll also find particularly high costs and punishment faced within healthcare. And again, ditto, this is an illustration that was done for the Washington Post for a piece that I wrote about medical care being particularly terrible for fatter bodies, particularly girls and women. It's been found that our healthcare is so lacking and so full of fat shaming that fat women and girls avoid going to the doctor and practice what's called healthcare avoidance in direct proportion to their BMI. So as BMI increases, we avoid going to seek medical care, resulting in our often having health problems that aren't picked up on until late in the piece. Or when we do go, we're subject to the simple advice, just lose weight, which most of us have tried, most of us have failed at over the long term, and also oftentimes neglects the true cause of symptoms that can be very different for people who, this is, quite a common, unfortunately, anecdote that you find in this literature where people have terrible medical problems like cancer and are told they're just too fat to go away and lose weight. And again, anecdotally, it looks like this is particularly happening to girls and women. In fact, all of the, I think roughly a dozen stories that I collected when I was doing the research for this book were of women who had had this experience. We also find, and we can get into this more, but I've touched on some of this material, really high costs for fat women when it comes to education and employment and basic freedoms and opportunities, like being able to move around the world free of things like what Aubrey Gordon calls fat calling, where someone is jeered at on the street for being too fat and not attractive enough, thereby illustrating this potent sense of entitlement on the part of some men to have women's bodies conform to this norm of thinness and norms of beauty and being small, as well as white, non-disabled, cis, and yeah, kind of athletic looking. Okay, so I'll finish there. I just have on this last slide some broader aims of the framework that won't surprise you given what's come before. And yeah, I'd love to open this up for Q&A about misogyny, fat phobia, and their potent intersection. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was such a jam-packed and delicious set of concepts and competitive ideas, and I really appreciate the willingness to be able to kind of, in your own voice, articulate some of the kind of ugliest aspects of these kinds of harms of misogyny and fat phobia. And so I'm going to give everybody a second to decompress. And I have a three-pronged question.
Right.
So if you want to take a note, because I have a question that was from philosophy club students and then a question from psychology club students, but they kind of overlap a little. So I'm going to kind of package it into a broader question, mostly motivated by my own interests, a host privilege.
Right.
To get
Absolutely.
So I'm teaching a philosophy and pop culture class this semester. I am a pop culture omnivore, and I have been very excited to see how students come to pop culture as a philosophical inquiry, right? So there's lots of stuff that they'll get both from media and then their own kind of consumption habits and stuff like that. You do this really lovely analysis of like Aronofsky's film The Whale and Amy Schumer's I Feel Pretty. So I think I'm also amplifying that you were able to kind of do that analysis. I think is so useful. I wish there was more people reading that kind of analysis alongside of the consumption of that kind of pop culture, traditional, film, TV, pop culture. So the Philosophy Club question, do you think that the rise in popularity of the TLC show My 600-Pound Life is an indicator that there's a fascination with fat bodies as inherently other? Is this a representation with society's desire to feel separate from, and even better than those who deviate from standard body types? So that kind of work of that reality show model, the TLC kind of phenomenon. And then from Psychology Club, additionally, another dimension of this is, how do you think that the arrival of new medications like Ozempic has shifted the debate on being fat and being proud of our bodies, or the possibility of being proud of our bodies? Just a quick note too, in Unshrinking, you talk a little bit about mental colonization, which I think is also a really fascinating concept. Maybe when we're thinking about pop culture, that happened to be one that a concept that stood out for me. And so yeah, so I appreciate you mentioning about epistemology, because I think it is a really powerful outline of that. So as again, that dimension of pop culture, but particularly 600-Pound Life and the reality shows, and then of course the Ozempic phenomenon, and what you think about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's such a great set of questions to like touch on so many aspects of the book that I didn't get a chance to talk about, actually. So I so appreciate it. So I think My 600-Pound Life and other similarly exploitative reality TV shows, which kind of home in on the fat body as like other, kind of fascinating, disgusting, it kind of points to the way, so empirical evidence shows very clearly that fat bodies are subject to a lot of disgust. So we're basically on par with politicians and second only to drug users and smokers in eliciting revulsion amongst social classes who would be thought to elicit disgust. And what disgust does is it doesn't just make us turn away from things, it can, but it actually has an interesting push-pull relationship with human attention. So in terms of moral psychology, things that are disgusting to us often have a bit of a lure as well. They often beckon a bit, they're often a bit glittering, as if like they want to pull us in, as well as repel us from touching, interacting with, getting too close to, but we want to stare from a distance at this kind of glittering object of disgust, almost like we want to get the measure of what it is without interacting and potentially contaminating ourselves with it. So I'm afraid TV is like the perfect vehicle for this sort of prurient interest in the fat body. And I'm glad you mentioned The Whale. I think that was a very similar, obviously fictional portrayal, but it had a very similar sort of prurient gaze towards the fat body as deeply other, deeply alien, very disgusting, deeply in need of reform, or else like immediately going to implode, die, yeah, urgently in need of correction. And of course, I'm not holding that like weights that are extremely high don't come with potential health costs and complications. But again, whatever someone's health status, they deserve humane, adequate healthcare, dignity, compassion, and a lack of the sort of prurient othering gaze that I think is often at stake in these pieces of popular culture. So yeah, I think these, and like one interesting piece of the puzzle that I haven't fully reckoned with in this general way is like, obviously fat phobia and sexual attraction are compatible because that's often what we find in porn searches. Like people are looking both with a certain amount of disgust, but with a certain amount of desire towards the fat body. And so that's another kind of area where you seem to find this layer of both being drawn to looking at fatness and even in a sort of explicitly desire-laced way, or a way that's overlaid with desire, but there's also disgust in the mix. So I'm not sure exactly how to wrap my head around this, but I cognize it somewhat as analogous, at least, to the way we think about junk food, where, I mean, this isn't how I feel about any food. I regard food as neutral, and all foods are good and appropriate on different occasions. But oftentimes people have this idea of like consuming junk food. It's delicious, but sort of disgusting, and they imbibe it and then want to like throw away the wrapper. So it's this interesting weave and dance between distance and fascination, desire and rejection. Um, yeah, I probably like will dig into this more at some point because I think there's more to say, but yeah, I won't go on more for now. The Ozempic question is so fascinating because I think part of what we've seen is just these drugs are a bit overhyped. Like they will take about 15% of someone's starting weight off on average under ideal conditions for very, very select sort of special populations that are, probably in the natural setting, it would be more like 10% weight loss, which is not that different than you find from diet and exercise actually in the short term. And when people go off these drugs, the weight comes roaring back. So it doesn't look to me like they're going to lead to that different of a situation than it's easier to take weight off in this way than via diet and exercise. But my worry is it will lead to a similar social phenomenon of weight cycling, where people lose weight via these drugs, are going to then go up in weight, given that the vast majority of people do discontinue these drugs because of their costs and side effects. So we found that about 80% of people will discontinue within a year. And if it leads to weight cycling, which is just going up and down in weight repeatedly, that turns out to have independent health harms for the human body, like metabolic dysfunction, immune dysfunction, cardiovascular consequences. So I'm worried the situation will be like what we've kind of seen with the cycles many fatter people get into of diet and exercise, lose weight temporarily, and then the weight comes back. And that happens again and again. It's really hard on the body. These drugs also have costs and side effects that worry me, like things like gastroparesis, gut paralysis, which aren't really talked about enough. It may affect only 1% of the population taking these drugs, but a potentially life-altering, even threatening condition that affects 1% of the population, we're talking about tens of thousands of people at least, if 10 million Americans are already prescribed these drugs, which is what we found late in 2023, and it's only increased since then, possibly exponentially, I think we'll find. So yeah, I have a lot of worries. One thing I don't worry about these drugs is that they make weight loss easier. There's this sense that you should have to work for it. Why? Like easier is better, actually. I call this the harder, better fallacy in my book. Like actually, if people are struggling to do something and it's worthwhile, better to make it easier than harder. Or possible, where for some people it just wasn't possible to lose weight beforehand through anything but starvation. Better this than the alternative, but I would prefer nothing, because many of these people who are taking these drugs are in the end doing so for cosmetic reasons and not health reasons. Given that, again, the majority of people who are in the overweight or obese category of the BMI charts don't have elevated mortality risks, according to epidemiological evidence, and yet a lot of people in those categories will think that they have to lose weight for their health, take these drugs that have health consequences and side effects, go off them, start regaining the weight cycle. It looks like a worrisome trend to me. But again, I don't worry because it's easier. I don't think people should have to work for it. I just think weight loss isn't usually a worthy goal. Okay, and also not a feasible goal in the long term. The third question about mental colonization is super interesting. I basically think of gaslighting as a form of mental colonization that like sort of annexes your mental territory. Like you have all these beliefs as well as desires and other attitudes, like a sense of well-being to which you're entitled in reality, which you lose through a sense that you should feel either rationally or morally or perhaps aesthetically to blame for or ashamed of mental states that you're entitled to in reality. So yeah, I was tempted at one point to use the metaphor of like gaslighting as colonization. And then I was like, well, I feel like it's actually sort of substituting one mystery for another because like there's no exact definition of colonization. And I sometimes feel like it can be a number of different things given how historical varied colonization can be. So I didn't end up using it all that much because I worried it would lead to more questions than it would answer. But I'm very happy for others to run with it because I think mental colonization as linked in a way to historical colonization and white supremacy. And you saw the explicit link with white supremacy in Sabrina Strings's work there. Yeah, I think all of that could be a kind of fruitful metaphor to run with for many purposes. Yeah, I just wanted to give you a sense of why I didn't run with it more explicitly or clearly in my own chapter on gaslighting. But yeah, great questions.
I I'll 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 do just one more round of questions, and then we had a couple of live chat questions.
Great.
Dr. Vetrano also came on, the advisor for our psychology club, is there. So we titled this "Make It Stop," and I think
Yes,
one of the
yeah.
things that's really important to mention in this is that the "Make It Stop" was really, it's the response of being, the subject of misogyny and fatphobia. It isn't like that we could make it stop. It's more like understanding that there's this moment in which it becomes so untenable to take on that experience of it again, the knowing what it is to be harmed by it, and the burdening of one to take on the responsibility for somehow being less fat or less or more appropriately, womanly, and play that role. But that the "make it stop" part of it, I think, is really important, which is why also the, pull yourself together, or you've let yourself go, some of these concepts that came to mind when we talk about that mental colonization, is that "make it stop" moment of like realizing that it's an untenable thing. So that said, so I'll do a couple more things, which is, you mentioned, we talked in the book about Roxane Gay's work, of course, very influential. And maybe what comes to mind for me, in aesthetics, we spend a lot of time talking about feminist art and feminist art practices as kind of using the politics of disgust to challenge the system. Again, think of someone like a filmmaker like Aronofsky using art as a vehicle to maintain a certain kind of misogyny and fat phobia, and then or kind of these kinds of harms. And then um the work of I think like Jane Antonini does a piece called Gnaw, where she just chews on like butter, like a big block of butter, like a big
Wow.
block of chocolate. Like it's really
Oh,
very
wow.
provocative, and like you
Yeah.
said, that glittering of like being attracted to and not really grappling with that kind of dissonance. But also Cressida Hayes is a philosopher that does a
Yeah.
piece. Foucault Goes to Weight Watchers is one of the
Yes,
pieces
I
that I
love
use,
that.
which is really wonderful. It's this
Yeah.
idea of like the phenomenon of like a Weight Watchers, but then taking on this kind of philosophical examination of the complexity of it. And then, of course, Audre Lorde comes to mind when you talk about a pornographic culture that takes the power of the erotic and turns it into this really demoralizing, kind of trafficked exchange of like goods and services that always end up, we're in a deficit, right? Um, so those are the ones that come to mind. But any authors or people that we could read, or that people that you read that you still find great resource in, and
Yeah.
then uh, but also maybe, and this is completely selfish, why might philosophy be a particular access point or point of insight? And then maybe we'll do, unless Dr. China wants to add in, then we'll do the two last live chat questions that we might add on to the recorded session.
Yeah. Well, I love that highlighting of the title because I think of pain as a make it stop state. So I am on the record as someone who thinks of, well, pain as either constituted by or closely associated with what I call a bodily imperative. Um, and this is drawing on work by philosophers like Cullen Klein, who have like theorized pain as an imperatival state that has like, it's not a descriptive content that says, uh, your finger is like ouchy. It's like a make it stop. There's a part of your body that's kind of throbbing with like, get off this limb, you're injured, get your hand out of the flame. It's like, it's an action, it's prescriptive, it's imperatival, it tells you to do something. Not always possible, but like the make it stop captures both the plaintive, somewhat sometimes futile or unfeasible, but like yeah, imperatival nature of someone who is caught in a pain state. And I think misogyny and fat phobia, especially in their intersection, it's just really freaking painful. It really puts people in a position of pain. Um, and yeah, so that was one of the reasons that I really loved this title that you chose, Jen, because Make It Stop is also how I think about hunger. I think, you know, you just drew to a really important link with Roxane Gay's amazing book, Hunger, where it's like the sense that you have not just like a descriptive state of, oh, my stomach's empty, I need some food, I should reason my way into how it's like, no, fill me, like eat that apple, like do it, you're hungry, like get that, eat that, grab that, gnaw that. Like again, like the body demands something and it commands something too. So in terms of that vein, like illustrating that pointy and painful intersection of misogyny and fat phobia, I would really recommend Aubrey Gordon's work, which I think is well known, but is really terrific. She's written two books. The first is called What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, really getting into the kind of structural and oppressive nature of fat phobia, as well as the personal aspects like the fat calling to which she was subject, street harassment. Her second book is You Just Need to Lose Weight and 19 Other Myths About Fat People, both highly recommended. And she also co-hosts with Michael Hobbs the excellent podcast Maintenance Phase that gets into lots of silly diets, alarming diets, myths and rumors about health and the relationship between weight and health, among other things. I would also say that another really important book that I recommend to everyone is Deshawn Harrison's Belly of the Beast, which looks at something that I don't talk about and that is in a way contrary to, but compatible with my focus in this talk, which is how fat phobia impacts masc and male, especially Black masc and male bodies. And they are a really powerful source of testimony about how Black masc bodies are targeted, for example, in police violence in America today. Under our racist white supremacist system of policing, Black male bodies and masc bodies are often perceived as a threat, or at least that's the excuse for homicidal racist white police officers. So again, if you really want to get into the make it stop states that people are kind of left in, that is a brilliant book. And yeah, Hunger, I think, is one, again, anyone should read if they have the bandwidth, because it delves into sexual violation, which is, again, a make it stop state. Like it's a bodily imperative to be free of sexual violation, I believe. It's a bodily imperative that is much more powerful and strong and intense than the desire for sex, which I think of as a mere desire, like contrary to incel logic. I think the way you can tell that is there's a bodily imperative being violated because you can torture someone. Would that things be otherwise, but you can torture someone by sexually violating them. You can't torture them by withholding sex. Anyway, so that together with the make it stop state of feeling really hungry and needing for that appetite to be satisfied. Yeah, I think we can get traction on just the power of those bodily states and psychological kind of vicissitudes, their imperatival nature through those works, as well as fat phobia more broadly. In terms of why philosophy, I mean, the truth is I don't think why philosophy has that unique like I think philosophy can add to the conversation in really interesting ways, but I don't think it has a unique position here. I sort of see it as like adding to a conversation that should be had by writers, activists, cultural critics, psychologists, sociologists, ethnographers, anthropologists, historians. And I think what philosophy can add that is cool, although again, like not uniquely, like is important, but not uniquely important, is we can cut through a lot of the dross. Like we can cut through some of the bad arguments that proliferate in this space, like the argument that you ought to be thin or you ought at least not to be fat. There's a really quick way of cutting through that with some philosophy, which is basically an ought implies can principle. And the contrapositive to that is if you can't control your body size minutely in the long term, which I think empirical evidence shows very clearly, and at least not in a humane, safe, feasible, reliable way, then it's not the case that you ought to morally. So like we are nicely positioned to like quick cutting through of like lots of cultural dross that we can show quickly why this is a really bad argument. And yeah, yes, I think that was it.
You do in the book too go through the trolley problem and the
Yes,
appearance
yeah.
of that, which is
That's more like why philosophy is bad,
fantastic.
actually. Why
Well,
we're
I
very
think
fat phobic.
as thought experiment,
Yeah,
it brings out the worst of what academic philosophy has not done well, which is
totally.
so I appreciate that as also, kind of knowing the references and knowing the use value of it and having somebody help provide a nice defense of how problematic that is
Yeah.
and how commonplace it is in a philosophy classroom to use the fat person as a kind of working trope. Let me just Dr. Patrona, you want to say or ask a question? The two live chat questions, if you want to answer them, it was about the connection between
Yes, I saw
incel and
them.
the Trumpism. If you want to talk a little bit about that, and also just like emphasizing that punishment quality of a fat phobic society. Those are there.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to in our last couple of minutes. So I think there's absolutely a link that I point to in my first book between the rise of Trumpism and the sense of entitlement of incel. It's an entitlement to be centered, to be cared for, to be loved, and Trump promises that to his white followers. And he does it. He promises them love and care and sort of to be daddy. Some Trump followers will explicitly call him daddy, by excluding others and marginalizing others and being violent and awful towards other people. So both the sense of entitlement to be violent and to be exclusionary, but also to like have tenderness and love and care, even if it costs other people their very lives and certainly their rights. That expectation of to be utterly centered, to be homed in on as the topic of conversation and the subject of conversation. It's actually why I think liberal calls to empathy were so hollow and misguided after the 2016 election, because you don't improve matters by feeding into the very sense of entitlement that is sparking that fire that just adds fuel to the fire and increases the flames. You have to douse it actually by kind of starving it of oxygen and saying, no, you're not entitled to be the center of the moral world anymore because everyone is equal, actually. And women matter just as much as you do in terms of what they want incel, and people of color matter just as much as you white folks who are not the priority. You're among others. And you have a sense of entitlement that is entirely illicit. So that's, I think, a very clear through line. I think it's a great connection that questionnaire, I believe it was Jessica, pointed to. And yeah, just in terms of Catherine's question, Yeah, I completely agree. Part of the punishment of fat phobia is just people not being able to fit into physical material space. And I have been there when I was larger than I am now. I now identify as a small fat person. The sense of physical pain that she rightly pointed to, and having bruises left on your body by seats that don't fit you, it's a powerful, both expressive pain of you don't belong here. Like I didn't belong in the classroom at Harvard where I could barely fit inside the kind of narrow fixed desk benches that were on offer, and the pain of yeah, literally your body is being subject to what I call the straitjacket of fat phobia, where you're physically constricted, jammed in, your flesh is cut up, bruised, and not cared for in a world that should be materially accessible to everyone.